Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. By the summer of 1920, the political and military situation in Asia Minor had become increasingly complex. After the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the war, the Allied powers had moved troops into the region to safeguard their interests and enforce the terms of the armistice until a peace treaty could be worked out. When Greek troops arrived in 1919 at the invitation of the Allies, things began to spin out of control, and guerrilla war between Greeks and Turks broke out. The arrival of the Greeks at Smyrna caused a nationalist uprising in Anatolia led by Ottoman officer Mustafa Kemal, which soon gained momentum and a powerful presence in the Ottoman parliament in Constantinople. Hardly the conditions for peace. You can find out more about events in 1919 in our previous episode about the Greco-Turkish War. In this episode, we'll take a look at the treaty's negotiation and signing, and the escalation of the Greco-Turkish War that went along with it until the end of 1920. And it all happened 100 years ago. So by early 1920, a state of war, albeit a low-intensity one, effectively existed in Anatolia, as Greece sought to take advantage of the weakness of the Turks to extend its borders across the Aegean and realize their dream of Greater Greece. But although the Ottoman government in British-occupied Constantinople had generally gone along with Allied demands, Kemal's nationalists now represented what amounted to a second Turkish government. They had political influence in the new parliament and growing military strength in the interior of the country, out of reach of the Allied and Greek forces along the coast. Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos now looked to the Allied powers, which Greece had joined in 1917, to deliver a peace treaty that would solidify Greek claims. When negotiations on an Ottoman peace treaty finally started in earnest at the London Conference in February 1920, the Entente alliance was increasingly strained. Old colonial rivalries, especially between Britain and France, were once again coming to the surface. These issues had been partly smoothed over with agreements on influence in Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, but the situation there was also tense and unstable. For British Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon, limiting French influence was a major priority. "We have been brought, for reasons of national safety, into an alliance with the French, which I hope will last. But their national character is different from ours, and their political interests collide with our own in many cases. I am seriously afraid that the great power from whom we may have the most to fear in the future is France." For Britain, the war against the Ottomans had been costly, and they had borne the brunt of the fighting. Now, Prime Minister David Lloyd George wanted the spoils of war. He wanted Britain's vital lines of transport and communication to India to be secured, and to gain access to the Black Sea. The way to achieve this was internationalizing the Bosphorus Straits and supporting a strong Greek state which would help Britain in the Mediterranean. The opening of the Straits would also make possible other British demands, like the creation of Armenian and Kurdish states in Asia Minor. The memory of the recent Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks was a motivating factor, as Lloyd George himself explained. There was not a British statesman of any party who did not have it in mind that if we succeeded in defeating this inhuman Ottoman Empire, our essential condition of the peace we should impose was the redemption of the Armenian valleys forever from the bloody misrule with which they had been stained by the infamies of the Turks. It was hoped that the United States would receive a League of Nations mandate for a new Armenia. Protestant Americans, including President Woodrow Wilson, had heard stories of Muslim oppression brought back by missionaries, and millions of dollars had been raised for Armenians. But any Western-supported Armenia was impossible without access to the Black Sea. For new French Premier Alexandre Mirand, the big issues were financial. The Ottoman Empire still owed France significant sums of money. And with new war debts of its own, France was eager to get its money back and gain extensive controls of Ottoman finances. To Mirand, the Greek presence in Anatolia was a problem. The instability that resulted from the Smyrna landing put Ottoman payments to France in danger, since the city was a major economic center and port now outside of Ottoman control. Eventually, France called for Greek troops to be removed and replaced by an international force. Italy, which by 1920 was abandoning its initial plans for expansion in Asia Minor, agreed. And even though Lloyd George favored the Greeks, many of his countrymen did not. Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, was worried that if Constantinople was given to the Greeks, Muslims in British India might cause trouble, since the city was still home to the Caliph. Secretary of State for War Winston Churchill and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Henry Wilson, also felt Greek forces should be removed, as no treaty was possible while they were in Anatolia. But Lloyd George, who was in the Liberal Party, dismissed these concerns on partisan grounds. We must secure Constantinople and the Dardanelles. You cannot do that effectively without crushing the Turkish power. Of course the military are against the Greeks. They always have been. They favor the Turks. The military are confirmed Tories. It is the Tory policy to support the Turks. That is why Henry Wilson, who is a Tory of the most crusted kind, is so much opposed to what we have done. For Venizelos, the whole problem of instability in the region was not because the Greeks were in Anatolia, but because there was no peace treaty. Once the peace was signed, the Turks would become, quote, conscious of their defeat, and the situation would calm down. He advocated for a severe treaty, giving Smyrna to Greece, creating French and Italian mandates, as well as a large Armenian state. If Turkey was not reduced to a small and weak state, he was of the opinion that millions of Christians would be exterminated. But despite his public bravado, in private, Venizelos was pessimistic. He had the support of Lloyd George, but not much more, and he knew it. Henry Wilson recalled a dramatic meeting with Venizelos. I told him straight out that he'd ruined his country and himself by going to Smyrna. And the poor man agreed. But he said the reason was because Paris had not finished off the Turk and had made peace with him. He begged me to tell Lloyd George that both Venizelos and Greece were done. I said I would. The old boy is done. So as the Entente powers debated the treaty amongst themselves and the Greeks waited anxiously for the result, events in Constantinople soon complicated issues even further. Now, since the elections of January 1920, Turkish nationalists had a powerful voice in the Ottoman parliament. The British realized that the assembly would be unlikely to agree to the kind of peace that the Allies were planning. And so they formally occupied Constantinople in March 1920, although informally they'd been there since 1918. Government buildings were occupied and some nationalists were arrested. The Ottoman government could now be relied upon to sign whatever peace treaty that the Allies wanted. The terms of the Treaty of Sèvres were then finalized in April. Britain got most of what it wanted, including the internationalization of the Straits and a guarantee of Armenian and Kurdish states. France and Italy were to gain spheres of influence in Anatolia and, more importantly, strong financial concessions. The Greeks were to gain the region of eastern Thrace, while Smyrna was to be administered by Greece but remain formally a part of Turkey. After 5 years, a referendum was to decide on its final fate. And like the other peace treaties, the Ottomans would pay reparations and had to reduce their armed forces to about 50,000 men and a handful of small boats. No air force was allowed. For Mustafa Kemal and the nationalists, the proposed treaty was political gold. They could now even more strongly frame their struggle as one against foreign occupation. No sooner had the draft proposal become public than reports began to emerge of British outposts coming under attack from nationalist forces. The question of enforcing the treaty now arose in earnest. Marshal Foch estimated that 27 divisions would be needed to defeat the nationalists and impose the treaty, far beyond the forces that the Allies had available in the region. Meanwhile, public opinion in Britain, France, and Italy generally opposed any reinforcement of troops. Venizelos now sensed an opportunity. He hoped that if he promised Greek forces to help defeat Kemal, he could perhaps convince the Allies to grant Greece what it wanted. A clear victory would also relieve political pressure that he was facing at home, to show results from the costly and dangerous Smyrna operation. The British and French now agreed to give the Greeks their chance, and Venizelos seemed to gain renewed confidence in Greek victory. So it was under these fragile circumstances and an impending escalation of the Greco-Turkish War that the Treaty of Sèvres was signed on August 10, 1920, just outside Paris. But even though the Sultan's government had signed it, it was clear to all that the real power in Turkey lay with Kemal, who refused to accept the terms. It would be military force, rather than a peace treaty, which would decide the fate of Asia Minor. Now, the lines of military control in Asia Minor had been more or less stable since the Greek and Allied landings in the first half of 1919. The Greeks remained, for the most part, within the Milne Line, about 100 kilometers around the city of Smyrna. By mid-1920, Greek forces in the Smyrna zone had been reinforced to about 60,000 men, and this force would grow to over 100,000 men by the end of the year. The Greek army was joined by auxiliary and paramilitary units made up of local Greek and Armenian militias. Now, generally, these bands could number as small as 50 men, although the Mauri Mari, or Black Fate guerrilla group, numbered about 5,000. The militias fought as light cavalry or engaged in guerrilla war in the countryside against Turkish villagers. The Turkish forces, many of them also irregular militias, operated freely in the Anatolian plateau, and local commanders often decided when and where they would strike. They harassed Greek units, but also attacked Greek and Armenian villages. But Kemal knew that he needed more than militias to win, and he tried in 1920 to absorb these irregular forces into a regular army, which did not always go particularly smoothly, as Turkish writer Halide Edip Adivar explained. The privates of this irregular army received from £15 to £30 a month, which was 3 times as much as what was paid to those of the regular army. And the regulars were badly clad and irregularly paid, besides being under a rigid discipline. Any poor and shabby private could desert his battalion and join the irregulars, where excellent equipment, a good horse, a silver-mounted whip, a belt of shining cartridges, a better and regular pay, as well as an easier life awaited him. Why should anyone be a regular soldier under such conditions? Despite these struggles, by late 1920, the regular Turkish army numbered around 86,000 men, with the conscription of men aged 16 to 60 filling out the ranks. Both the Greek and Turkish forces were armed with a mixture of weapons of different ages and national manufacture. Kemal even claimed to have intercepted 40,000 British Lee Enfield rifles destined for Armenian and White Russian units, and after the war, he would send Lloyd George a sarcastic letter thanking him for the contribution. Armored cars and aircraft were of limited use on the battlefields of Anatolia, though the 55-plane Greek Air Force was used for reconnaissance. Cavalry, however, was key, especially for the Turks, who used the small, hardy Anatolian ponies to strike Greek supply trains and rear areas. So it was these two forces that would clash in the coming Greek offensive in the summer of 1920. Greek morale had been suffering up until now, since they'd had to stay behind the Mill line and were frustrated at not being able to strike back when attacked by Turkish irregulars, who could then escape eastwards across the line. In June, that would all change. Although the Allies and Greeks had now agreed to a Greek attack to defeat Kemal, there were still political concerns about how to justify it, especially since most Western publics had little stomach for more fighting. A clash between British troops and Turkish irregulars on June 14th near Izmit provided a suitable justification. British General Milne called for reinforcements, but with none available, the Greeks offered to help. Britain and France gave tacit approval for the Greeks to cross the Milne line and strike into the Anatolian interior to defeat Kemal. The Greeks were to claim that they were simply responding to Turkish provocations, which would justify the offensive to the Allied publics. This plan did not impress everyone. Lord Curzon, now increasingly opposed to Lloyd George, was not very optimistic. Venizelos thinks his men will sweep the Turks into the mountains. I doubt it will be so. On June 22nd, Greek forces crossed the Milne line in two main thrusts, and at first, their objectives were relatively conservative. This was not yet an all-out push for the nationalist base at Ankara. The main attack was to advance northeast, towards Bandirma and the Sea of Marmara. The secondary force headed east towards Alaşehir and the Anatolian heartlands. In late June and early July, Anglo-Greek amphibious landings backed up by the guns of the Royal Navy captured several coastal towns, including after a hard fight at Mudanya, while the Archipelago Division, with cavalry forces ranging ahead, captured nearby Bursa on July 8th and Iznik on July 12th. At the same time, Greek forces also advanced on the European side into eastern Thrace, overwhelming a disorganized Turkish defense and capturing Edirne. Turkish forces in the region withdrew into Bulgaria. By August, Greek troops had advanced around 240 kilometers into the interior of Anatolia as far as Uşak, and had sustained only negligible losses. But at this stage, Italian and French delegates were calling for the campaign to be stopped. Now, militarily speaking, Greece had two options. They could hold fast in Anatolia and complete the capture of eastern Thrace, or ignore Thrace and concentrate on Anatolia. Greek commander Leonidas Paraskevopoulos suggested advancing in Anatolia towards Ankara and Konya. By capturing the major railways in the area, the Greeks could deprive Kemal of logistical support, while also splitting his forces on either side of the central Anatolian desert. Paraskevopoulos felt that many locals did not fully support Kemal, and a rapid advance was required to take advantage of Turkish disorganization. Venizelos, on the other hand, was hesitant. He had hoped that Greek troops would be placed under British command, but this had not happened. He had also hoped that the Sultan's small army, known as the Army of the Caliphate, would fight alongside the Greeks, but it had disintegrated and mostly joined the nationalists. And with an election looming in Greece, Venizelos was under domestic pressure to demobilize the army. So he appealed again to Lloyd George to commit even more British troops and occupy more of Turkey. But this too did not come to pass. So by early fall, Greece seemed to have the Turks on the run, and during the fighting, both sides accused the other of committing atrocities against civilians. Turkish forces offered sporadic resistance to the Greek army before the fall of Uşak, but after that, Kemal, who was an experienced commander from the First World War, took over command himself and prepared to strike back. Now, for the most part, during the Greek offensive, the Turkish irregular forces had withdrawn in the face of superior Greek firepower and limited themselves to opportunistic counterattacks. Even so, nationalist forces raided the summer resort of Beykoz just next to Constantinople on July 5th, taking one British officer prisoner. Incidents like this one led to dramatic reports in the media. The New York Times, for example, accused the Turks of taking dozens of female hostages, and the British of threatening to destroy mosques by aerial bombing. By the start of the fall of 1920, Turkish forces had been cleared out of much of western Anatolia and pushed back to the central plateau. But this was by no means a disaster, because the Turks had suffered minimal losses and still had plenty of territory in their rear for strategic depth. And the further the Greeks advanced, the more their vulnerable supply lines became stretched. On October 24th, Kemal launched a counterattack at the Gediz River with about 7,300 men, 29 machine guns, and 18 artillery pieces. Now, although the Greeks were able to withstand the pressure, it showed that Kemal was not beaten and his army was growing stronger. With the Greek advance halted, Kemal now turned his attention to securing his eastern border, where Armenian forces were also fighting the nationalist Turks in the Turkish-Armenian War. In October, Turkish forces crossed the old Tsarist frontier, capturing Kars. This renewed the cycle of ethnic violence that had devastated the region during the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks, and again when Armenian forces returned after 1918 and took revenge. Kemal's understanding with Bolshevik Russia was successful, and Armenia was crushed between Turkish and Bolshevik forces in November. Despite Allied plans for a large Armenian state in the Treaty of Sèvres, they provided little assistance as Armenia was defeated. The US had failed to join the League of Nations, which made the idea of an American protectorate over Armenia a pipe dream, and it was soon forced to become a Soviet republic. With Kemal's northern and eastern flanks now secure, he could now concentrate all of his forces, including his new regular army, on the front with Greece. And as winter approached, both sides dug in and planned out their next moves. Venizelos had scored a military victory, but Kemal had retained his base and was improving and enlarging his army at a pace that the Greeks could not hope to match in the long term. The future was uncertain, but one thing was for sure: there was no peace treaty in sight. That the Treaty of Sèvres was failing was not lost on the Allied powers. Lloyd George still supported the Greeks, but the French and Italians did not, and distanced themselves from Greece even before the summer offensive began. French troops had been fighting Kemal in the French occupation zone on Turkey's southern coast, but now wanted out so they could concentrate on Syria. The French hoped that they could get the economic and financial concessions that they wanted from Ottoman Turkey from Kemal in exchange for withdrawing their forces. Italy was struggling with violent internal political problems and did not want to see a strong Greek rival in the Mediterranean. In fact, the Italians even considered helping Kemal to prevent the Greeks from getting too strong. Supporting Greece and the Treaty of Sèvres was no longer in the national interests of Italy or France. With the British divided and the Americans absent, Sèvres was bound to fail. So the Treaty of Sèvres became the peace that never was. It was surpassed by events, not only the shifting interests of the Allies and the stalled Greek offensive, but the growing power of Kemal and nationalist Turkey. The treaty was clearly unenforceable and was never ratified after it was signed. In the words of historian A.E. Montgomery, the Treaty of Sèvres was stillborn. The failure of the treaty and the course of the Greco-Turkish conflict in 1920 left Mustafa Kemal in an advantageous situation. The Ottoman government was virtually irrelevant. The Allies no longer committed to a common policy, and the Greeks isolated and exposed. He had survived the summer offensive and was now ready to gather his forces and strike back against the Greeks the following year. Despite the difficulties for the Greeks, they still clung to the hope that their victories in 1920 and the continued support of Britain might yet save the Greek cause. Unfortunately for Venizelos, a fight between a dog and a monkey would soon have unintended and disastrous consequences for his vision of Greater Greece. Thanks again to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this episode. CuriosityStream is a streaming service offering you thousands of high-quality documentaries. And right now, you can save up and get 26% off. That's just $14.79 for an entire year. When you sign up at curiositystream.com/thegreatwar, you also get Nebula bundled in with your account. On Nebula, you can watch a whole variety of creators like us ad-free and support them at the same time. There's original content on Nebula as well, which you won't see on YouTube. For example, we've released our documentary series 16 Days in Berlin on Nebula. It's the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin, one of the last big battles of World War II. And for several reasons, we wouldn't be able to upload it here due to YouTube's content restrictions. So go to curiositystream.com/thegreatwar and sign up for just $14.79 a year. We'd like to thank Valantis Athanasiou and Mark Newton for their help with this episode. And as usual, you can find all our sources for this episode in the video description below. If you want to support our channel, you can support us on Patreon, and the links for that are in the video description below as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1920, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel not afraid to take an odyssey into the Greco-Turkish War.